Hello all, and welcome to the Arizona Public Health Training Center's question and answer period for the presentation you just saw. I'm here with Dr. Amanda Kraus. Amanda, thank you for joining us here for our center today. First thing I wanted to mention, for those of you who might have come in late, one of the things that you can do to ask questions is please make sure your screen is not in full screen mode, and you'll notice a little chat button down in the bottom right hand corner of your screen. If you press on that button, you can type in your questions and then hit say, and your questions will be sent right to us, and we'll be able to answer your questions there. I also wanted to mention that there is an evaluation online, and if you could fill out that evaluation for us, we'd really appreciate it. So Dr. Kraus, first question that came in, which I think we answered a little bit later on, but maybe we could elaborate on a little bit here. The question was, I really like the idea of designing for the broadest audience. That being said, how do we identify all the barriers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really important question. And I would say that this whole idea of reframing disability and identifying barriers is a process. Something that I think we can do when we're kind of looking at our space, our practice, our processes is, kind of take notice of anything that any group of people are doing differently or separately. So in this case, if we're looking at the experience of disabled people, what are they required to do in advance or after the fact? What questions come up around how to participate or how to access? That could be a separate entrance, which we did talk about in the presentation, but this kind of becomes really familiar to us, but it's still separate, it's still different. So trying to take note of anything that people are doing differently or separate from the larger group. Something else to look at is maybe where disabled folks have a lower participation. If you can kind of observe or notice where you're not seeing disabled folks or students or professionals participate, there might be a reason around access for that. So I think that we can kind of audit different areas of our work. We can look at physical access, curricular access, informational access, and just kind of start to brainstorm, really take a good look at our practice and our process and think about where we can streamline access and do more to incorporate, access more easily. And I would certainly ask for feedback from disabled folks. If you have relationships with people, if there's an opportunity to give feedback, then I would be seeking it from the disability community.
Great, thank you. I think a lot of what you've mentioned is things that people don't normally think of as barriers, and that accommodations can be barriers at times. So we actually have one more question that came in while we were speaking. Do you have any recommendations for teachers or faculty on what not to do when trying to create an inclusive classroom?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if I can say what not to do, because I think that, ultimately every classroom experience is going to be different. The student group will be different. The instructor will be different. I think if we are looking at the classroom environment, kind of thinking about all those different areas for access, physical access, can people move around and sit where they need to be and participate where they need to be? Curricular access, what's on my syllabus and how am I designing activities, how am I designing assignments, exams to have the lowest amount of barriers. Information when I put things online, when I'm presenting materials. So if we can kind of think about all those different areas and then again think about the largest possible audience. Not always thinking about just what do I do for this one disabled student or what happens when I look at my roster and there's a list of DRC students. But so really just thinking broadly about what we can do to make the experience good for everyone. And I would offer, to come and connect with me or other staff at DRC, because we do sit down and brainstorm and consult with folks on, ways to be creating more inclusive experiences.
That would be great, so that you'd be open for people to come in and talk to you, sit down with you, and you could be able to help them out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would encourage folks to think more about that diverse audience rather than what do I do to accommodate disabled students? Because, so that might be a what not to do, but because we don't know. We don't know what people's needs are. We don't know how the student will experience the course. We're only speculating, I think, when we try to guess. So the best way to think about it is broadly, just access, inclusion, how do I create a welcoming, safe environment for everyone? And I think that the disability access will just kind of fall into place.
It'll kind of fall into place if everyone's great. Thank you. We did have another question come in. What are some common mistakes people make when trying to create accessible materials?
Again, I think assuming we know, I mean, I think something that I could share is that just because something's electronic doesn't mean it's accessible. There are ways to create accessible PDF files. There's lots of programs and technology. And again, I think if you visit our website, there's some basic information, but we also have staff and other resources who are certainly more expert than I am in electronic materials and technology. But it doesn't have to be complicated either, I think is something that's encouraging, that if I have, let's say I'm using a PowerPoint for my workshop or for my class, and I email that out in advance, I mean, that's a step in the right direction. Then for all the reasons that I said in the presentation, people can use it the way that works best for them. So it doesn't need to be extremely complicated. I think a lot of people think with alternate formats, lots of folks think Braille right away. How do I get something printed in Braille? And students who even identify as low vision or blind might not use Braille. So really trying to think about, broader ways to produce materials for folks. And so again, that's a kind of a quick answer, but we have lots of folks and resources at DRC who could answer that probably in greater detail than I could.
Great, thank you. So a lot of the accommodations that you would just naturally do for anybody would be, everyone would broadly fall into that category.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the idea, and when we were kind of wrapping up the presentation, ultimately when we start to shift the conversation away from what do I do for disabled people, because that's the question at hand. But if we really shift to how do I design something that's accessible, how do I design something that's inclusive, then then we're really not as concerned with the one disabled person or the one wheelchair user or the one blind student. We're really thinking about the overall experience, and ultimately I think that's what we should be concerned with.
Great, thank you. We have one more question that just came in. In your interaction with different communities of disabled people, is differently abled a common disliked term? In other words, is disabled a preferred term?
That's a great question. There's lots we could talk about relative to language. In my kind of circle and in my work and my kind of profession or in my communication with groups, I think that differently abled is kind of frowned upon, because it's a euphemism, right? I mean, so if we can't say disability, then what is that implying about what it means? It's that it's so bad we can't talk about it. It's so offensive we can't name it. And so, ultimately I think saying a disabled individual or a person with a disability, both of those ways to talk about disability are fine and pretty neutral. Disability is the word that we have. And lots of folks have questions about it or wonder about how it makes people feel, but it's the word that we have. And if we can't talk about it, I think we need to kind of check ourselves and think about why we feel uncomfortable saying that word and the impact of the word.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. It looks like that's the end of our questions for now. Just in finishing up, we had one question that the center was talking about, just with all this stuff and how broad everything is and getting going, just as we're leaving here, maybe you could tell us a little bit about where somebody who wants to be an advocate for getting rid of the advocation process overall, where would be a good place for somebody to start?
Right, that's a great question, because I think that this concept can feel overwhelming, that there's so much to do and where do I begin? And so I would begin with my kind of sphere of influence. What do I have direct control over? Who do I influence? Who am I working with? And just kind of sit and think about the areas in which I'd want to affect change. I wouldn't worry about costs or the long-term process of making change at this moment. There's lots of things that we can do that don't cost any money. That could be thinking about our language, and sitting down and with some colleagues or some students and really talking about language. around disability. Translating that conversation into our websites, our materials, how are disabled folks represented in our processes, in our materials, and things like that don't really cost much money, but they are working at sending a clear message that disability is valued and disabled folks are welcome. And even reworking a process, whether that's redesigning an exam or a registration process, it doesn't necessarily cost money either. It's just kind of sitting down and thinking, this is how I think about disability. If I believe that disability is valued, it's important, it contributes to the richness and the diversity of our large community, then how do I demonstrate that in my practice and in my actions? And it does take a while, to make these changes, because we have all been socialized to think that disability is negative or separate, so even just that process of reflection, I think, will take a while, but it's a very important kind of first step in making good change and being advocates for access, like you're saying.
Yeah. It really lends to the theory of change starts at home.
Right. Absolutely.
Great. Well, it looks like we've run out of time. Once again, I would like to thank Dr. Kraus for being here with us today to answer questions, and I'd like to let everyone know in the audience, this training will be available online. We'll just get it loaded up and give us a day, and we'll have this online. And there'll also be an area where you can ask questions online, and we can get those questions to Dr. Kraus, and she'd be more than happy to answer them for you. Once again, thank you very much for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.